The willow trees whispered in the evening breeze as Madeline Everett pulled into the driveway of the Victorian house she had lovingly restored over the past 7 years. Something felt wrong. Andrew's sleek black Audi was parked at an odd angle, and there was another car, a cherry-red convertible, that didn't belong. Her stomach tightened as she climbed the porch steps, her heels clicking against the reclaimed wood she'd personally selected from a demolished 19th-century farmhouse in Vermont. With each step, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. 7 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the signs: Andrew's increasingly late nights at the office, the mysterious text messages, the sudden business trips. But nothing prepared her for what awaited inside. "Andrew," she called, dropping her keys into the hand-painted ceramic bowl they'd bought on their honeymoon in Santorini. "I'm home." Silence greeted her, followed by hushed whispers and the sound of hurried footsteps. Madeline followed the noise to their bedroom, another restoration labor of love with its original crown molding and hardwood floors. Andrew stood with his back to her, hastily buttoning his shirt. On their bed, the antique four-poster she'd discovered at an estate sale and refinished herself, sat a woman Madeline recognized immediately: Vivian Daniels, Andrew's new associate from the firm. "Maddie," Andrew said, his voice oddly calm as he turned to face her. "You're home early." The world seemed to tilt beneath Madeline's feet. The familiar room suddenly felt foreign, as if she'd stepped into someone else's life. "What is she doing here?" Madeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivian had the audacity to smirk, running a hand through her perfectly highlighted blonde hair. At 32, nearly a decade younger than Madeline, everything about her screamed ambition and hunger, from her designer clothes to her calculated smile. "I think it's pretty obvious," Vivian said, standing to smooth her wrinkled skirt. Andrew cleared his throat. "Maddie, we need to talk." Those 4 words, the harbingers of doom in any relationship, hung in the air between them. "I want a divorce," he continued, his voice devoid of the emotion that should accompany the ending of a 7-year marriage. "I've been meaning to tell you, but you've been too busy fucking your associate?" Madeline finished, surprising herself with her crude language. She rarely swore, a habit from her strict upbringing that even her rebellious college years hadn't fully broken. Andrew's jaw tightened. "Don't be crass, Madeline. This isn't like you. And betrayal isn't like you, Andrew. Or at least, that's what I thought." "People change," he said, as if discussing a preference in restaurants rather than the demolition of their life together. "Vivian and we connect on a level that you and I never did. Is that right?" Madeline's voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking through her. "And how long has this connection been going on?" 8 months, Vivian volunteered, gathering her designer handbag, the kind Madeline, with her modest restoration consultant salary, could never justify buying. "And it's serious." 8 months. While Madeline had been planning their anniversary trip to the Amalfi Coast, Andrew had been planning his exit strategy. "I think you should leave," Andrew said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Take some time to process this. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and he's drafting the divorce papers." Madeline blinked, momentarily stunned. "You want me to leave? This is my home too." Andrew sighed, as if her response was an inconvenience rather than a reasonable reaction. "Maddie, don't make this difficult. I'm staying in the house. Vivian is moving in tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" The word felt like a physical blow. "You can't be serious." "We've already discussed it," Andrew continued, reaching out to place a patronizing hand on her shoulder. "I'll be generous in the settlement. You'll be taken care of." She jerked away from his touch, anger rising to replace her shock. I don't need to be taken care of, Andrew. And I'm not leaving my home. It's not just your home, Vivian interjected, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You need to be realistic, Madeline. The house belongs to both of you, and Andrew has decided he's staying. Madeline turned her gaze to the younger woman, taking in her perfectly manicured nails and the diamond tennis bracelet that glinted on her wrist, a bracelet that looked suspiciously like the one Madeline had seen Andrew eyeing at Tiffany's last month. Actually, Madeline said slowly, a calm settling over her like a protective cloak, the house doesn't belong to both of us. Andrew frowned. What are you talking about? We bought it together. No, Andrew. I bought it. Remember? You were too busy building your career to handle the tedious details of home ownership. She watched as uncertainty flickered across his face, followed by dismissal. That's a technicality. We've been married 7 years. It's marital property. Not exactly, Madeline replied, feeling a strange sense of empowerment beginning to unfurl within her. My grandfather left me a trust specifically for purchasing property. It's in my prenup, the one you insisted on because you didn't want me coming after your future earnings. The prenup had been Andrew's idea, a safeguard against what he called gold-digging divorce culture. At the time, Madeline hadn't minded, she had her own money and had never been interested in his. The irony wasn't lost on her now. Property purchased using trust funds designated before marriage remains separate property, even in a marriage, she continued, recalling the exact wording from the document they'd signed 7 years ago. You insisted on that clause, remember? To protect your family inheritance. Andrew's face paled. But I've been paying the mortgage. No, Madeline corrected him, you've been paying me rent, essentially. Check the paperwork, all of it. As a historical restoration consultant who specialized in preserving architectural heritage, Madeline had developed an eye for detail and a knack for meticulous documentation. Every payment, every arrangement was filed away in her home office, the room that Andrew had barely set foot in over the years. This is ridiculous, Vivian snapped, clearly sensing the shift in dynamics. Andrew, tell her she's being delusional. But Andrew remained silent, his legal mind likely racing through the implications of what Madeline had just revealed. I'm not leaving my house, Madeline said, her voice steady. If anyone's leaving, it's you too. You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things, Andrew. You can't do this, he finally said, his confident demeanor cracking. You can't just throw me out. Actually, I can. And I will. She walked to the bedroom door and paused, turning back to face them. And Andrew? I'll be speaking with the partners at your firm. I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about an associate sleeping with a senior partner. Especially given the firm's explicit policy against such relationships. Vivian's smug expression collapsed. You wouldn't. I would, Madeline replied, surprised by her own certainty. Actions have consequences. It's time you both learned that. With that, she closed the door behind her and walked to the guest room, her legs somehow carrying her despite the earthquake that had just decimated her life. Once inside, she finally allowed the tears to fall, silent rivers of grief for the marriage she'd thought was solid ground. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a steely determination that her grandmother would have recognized. The same determination that had driven Madeline to restore forgotten buildings to their former glory was now focused on rebuilding her own life from the rubble Andrew had left behind. Tomorrow would be soon enough to face the legal battles ahead. Tonight, she would allow herself to mourn what was lost. But she would not be moved from the house that was rightfully hers, the house she had poured her heart and soul into restoring, just as she would now restore herself. 2 days later, Madeline sat in the sleek downtown office of Eliza Harding, one of the city's most formidable divorce attorneys. The room was a stark contrast to Madeline's Victorian aesthetic, all chrome and glass with views of the city skyline that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. "So let me get this straight," Eliza said, reviewing the documents spread across her desk. "Your husband brought his mistress into your home, told you to leave, and is now threatening to contest the prenup because," she glanced down at her notes, "you ambushed him with information about the house's ownership?" Madeline nodded, absently twisting her wedding ring, a simple platinum band that now felt like a shackle. "That's correct." "And did he leave when you asked him to?" The memory of the previous morning brought a grim smile to Madeline's face. "Not willingly. I had to call a locksmith to change the locks after he left for work. When he returned with Vivian that evening, her arms full of moving boxes, they found their things packed and waiting on the porch." Eliza raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Bold move." "I've spent my career preserving history," Madeline replied. "I know how to protect what's valuable." The attorney nodded approvingly as she examined the prenuptial agreement Madeline had brought. "This is solid. Your grandfather's trust was clearly established before the marriage, and the house was purchased using those funds exclusively." Madeline had spent the previous night carefully assembling documentation, the trust paperwork, the house deed, bank statements showing the purchase transaction, and the prenup itself. If there was one thing restoration work had taught her, it was the value of thorough documentation. "Andrew won't give up easily," she warned. "He's a corporate attorney. Fighting is what he does." "Let him try," Eliza replied, her confidence reassuring. "From what I can see, your case is airtight. The house is yours, as is the trust. What we need to focus on now is making sure he doesn't try to claim any of the appreciation in value since the purchase." Madeline leaned forward, her determination matching the attorney's. "What do I need to do?" As Eliza outlined their strategy, Madeline's phone buzzed repeatedly with texts from Andrew, alternating between pleas and threats. She silenced it without looking, focusing instead on the path forward. By the time she left Eliza's office, armed with a clearer understanding of the legal battle ahead, Madeline felt something she hadn't experienced since finding Vivian in her bedroom: control. The late afternoon sun caught in her auburn hair as she walked to her car, highlighting the strands of gray she'd recently noticed, badges of the wisdom she was now grateful for. At 41, Madeline Everett was starting over, but she wasn't starting from nothing. She had her career, her home, and a newfound understanding of her own resilience. Andrew had taken her trust and her years, but he wouldn't take anything else. As she drove home, truly her home now, Madeline found herself thinking of her grandmother, Eleanor, who had established the trust that was now her shield. A fiercely independent woman who had built a successful antique business in an era when female entrepreneurs were rare, Eleanor had always told her, "Property is power, Maddie. Never forget that." Madeline hadn't fully understood those words until now. But as she pulled into the driveway of the Victorian house that stood as a testament to her passion and expertise, she silently thanked her grandmother for the foresight that was now her salvation. "He's offering what?" Madeline nearly choked on her tea as Eliza delivered the news over the phone a week later. "Half the value of the house," the attorney repeated. "His team is arguing that while the purchase was made with your separate property, the renovations were paid for with marital funds, and therefore he's entitled to half the appreciation." Madeline set her mug down on the kitchen counter, her mind racing. The extensive renovations had indeed increased the property's value substantially, from the $850,000 purchase price to a current market valuation of nearly $1.4 million. But I did most of the work myself, she protested. My expertise, my labor. I know, Eliza interrupted. And that's our counterargument. We'll need documentation of all the work you performed, estimates of the value of your professional services, and any receipts showing materials you purchased with your separate funds. Madeline glanced at her home office, where meticulous records of every renovation project lived in color-coded files. Her organizational habits, which Andrew had often teased her about, would now be her defense. I have everything, she assured Eliza. But there's something else you should know. She hesitated, the painful memory still fresh. 2 years ago, Andrew borrowed against his 401k to invest in a startup that ultimately failed. I offered to help him repay it using money from my trust, but he refused. Said it was his debt to handle. That plays in our favor, Eliza noted. It establishes a pattern of keeping finances separate, especially in significant matters. After hanging up, Madeline wandered through the house, touching the surfaces she had so carefully restored, the original banister she'd stripped and refinished by hand, the antique tiles she'd salvaged from a demolished hotel to create a unique kitchen backsplash. Every corner of this house told a story of her vision and dedication. And now, ironically, these same details would help her keep what was rightfully hers. Her phone rang again, Andrew, for the 4th time that day. After a moment's hesitation, she answered. What do you want, Andrew? His voice was placating, the tone he used when trying to soothe difficult clients. Maddie, we need to talk face to face. This doesn't have to be so adversarial. You made it adversarial when you brought your mistress into our home and tried to evict me, she replied, surprised by her own calm. That's not fair. I offered you a generous settlement. For something that was never yours to begin with, she cut in. The answer is no, Andrew. I'm not meeting with you. All communication goes through Eliza now. Damn it, Madeline. His cultivated composure finally cracked. You know how much that house means to me. My reputation at the firm should have been considered before you started sleeping with an associate, she finished. Goodbye, Andrew. She ended the call and blocked his number, a symbolic gesture that felt more empowering than she'd expected. Then she sat down at her desk and began assembling the documentation Eliza had requested. The task was therapeutic, each receipt and photograph reinforcing her connection to the home she had created. By evening, she had compiled a comprehensive portfolio that clearly demonstrated her professional and personal investment in the property. As she worked, a plan began forming in her mind, not just for defending what was hers, but for building something new from the ashes of her marriage. The mediation room at Eliza's firm felt like neutral ground in a war zone. Madeline sat straight-backed in her chair, facing Andrew and his attorney, Victor Parsons, across a polished conference table. The tension was palpable, crackling in the air like static electricity. Andrew looked haggard, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. The confident swagger had diminished, replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting with his platinum cufflinks, a wedding gift from Madeline. Before we begin, Victor said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 30 years in family law, my client would like to propose an amicable resolution that would benefit both parties. Eliza raised an eyebrow. We're listening. Andrew cleared his throat. Madeline, I'm willing to give up any claim to the house if you'll agree not to speak to the partners about the situation with Vivian. The unspoken hung heavy in the air. Vivian had already been transferred to another department, but a full disclosure to the partnership could end both their careers at the firm. Madeline studied her husband's face, noting the lines of stress around his eyes, the pallor beneath his usually healthy complexion. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the compassion that had once been the foundation of their relationship. "No," she said simply. Andrew's composure faltered. "No? Just like that?" "Just like that," Madeline repeated, her voice unwavering. "You don't get to dictate the terms of your own consequences, Andrew." She watched the realization dawn across his face, the understanding that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. For 7 years, Andrew had steered their marriage like a captain confident in his navigation. Now he found himself adrift in unfamiliar waters, with Madeline holding the only compass. Victor leaned forward, his silver-framed glasses catching the fluorescent light. "Mrs. Everett, I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Litigation can be messy and expensive." "I'm aware of the costs," Madeline replied, lifting her chin slightly. "But there are different kinds of expenses, Mr. Parsons. Some financial, some moral. I'm prepared to pay both." Eliza suppressed a smile, sliding a folder across the table. "We've prepared our own proposal. My client is willing to buy out any legitimate interest Mr. Everett might claim in the property improvements, though we maintain these claims are tenuous at best." Victor opened the folder, his expression carefully neutral as he reviewed the documents. Andrew leaned over, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is insulting," he finally sputtered. "You're offering me less than a quarter of the increased value." "I'm offering you exactly what you contributed," Madeline countered. "I've calculated the value of my professional services as a restoration consultant, services I provided free of charge during our marriage. When subtracted from the total improvement value, that's what remains." She pushed another document forward, a detailed accounting of every hour she'd spent on restoration work, priced at her standard professional rate, along with before and after appraisals demonstrating the impact of her expertise. "As you can see," Eliza added, "my client's professional contributions account for approximately 70% of the property's appreciation. The remaining 30% reflects general market increases and the actual monetary investments made during the marriage." Victor's eyes narrowed as he scanned the meticulously prepared figures. These valuations would need to be independently verified. "By all means," Madeline agreed. "I welcome any legitimate scrutiny." Andrew slammed his hand on the table, his composure finally shattering. "This is ridiculous. I lived in that house for 7 years. I paid bills. I maintained it." "You painted the garage door once," Madeline interrupted, her tone measured. "And complained about it for 3 months afterward." A flush crept up Andrew's neck. "You're twisting everything." "No, Andrew. I'm simply stating facts. Something you seem to struggle with lately." The mediation deteriorated after that, ending without resolution. As they gathered their belongings, Andrew caught Madeline's arm, his fingers pressing into her flesh with desperate urgency. "Madeline, please. Think about what you're doing." She looked down at his hand, then up at his face, this man who had once been the center of her world, now reduced to a stranger clutching at the edges of a life he'd willingly discarded. "I am thinking, Andrew." Clearly, for the first time in years. She gently removed his hand. "You should try it sometime." The Victorian's wraparound porch had always been Madeline's sanctuary. She sat in her favorite wicker chair, watching dusk settle over the neighborhood as she nursed a glass of Cabernet. The September air carried hints of wood smoke and fallen leaves, a melancholy perfume that suited her mood. 3 months had passed since the failed mediation. 3 months of legal maneuvers, escalating tensions, and sleepless nights. The divorce proceedings had taken on the character of trench warfare, slow, grinding, and devastating for all involved. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diana, her younger sister and staunchest ally through the ordeal. Court tomorrow. Need anything? Moral support? Brass knuckles? Madeline smiled despite herself. Diana had never liked Andrew, seeing through his polished veneer to the ambition beneath. He loves himself more than he'll ever love you, she'd warned before the wedding. Like many painful truths, it had taken years to reveal itself fully. Just you, Madeline texted back. And maybe some of that emergency chocolate you always carry. The hearing tomorrow would address Andrew's latest attempt to claim a portion of her inheritance, arguing that it had been commingled with marital assets. Eliza had assured her the claim was baseless. The trust structure had been specifically designed to prevent such situations, but the prospect of another courtroom confrontation left Madeline drained. Her solitude was interrupted by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A sleek silver sedan pulled up, a rental, judging by the generic plates. Madeline straightened, instantly alert. The car door opened, and her breath caught as a familiar figure emerged. Vivian. The younger woman paused at the foot of the porch steps, her confidence visibly faltering as she looked up at Madeline. Gone was the designer wardrobe, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater that looked startlingly ordinary. I need to talk to you, Vivian called, her voice lacking its usual sharp-edged poise. Madeline considered ignoring her, or worse, unleashing months of accumulated rage. Instead, curiosity won out. Come up, then. Vivian climbed the steps slowly, as if traversing a minefield. When she reached the porch, she remained standing, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. Well? Madeline prompted, not bothering to offer a seat. What's so important that you'd brave the dragon's lair? A flicker of something, embarrassment? Regret crossed Vivian's face. I want to tell you that I'm not with Andrew anymore. The statement hung in the air between them, oddly anticlimactic. And you felt the need to deliver this news personally? Madeline asked, taking a deliberate sip of her wine. How thoughtful. Vivian flinched at the sarcasm. I thought you should know that I'm testifying in your divorce proceedings. Voluntarily. This got Madeline's attention. She set her glass down, studying the younger woman with newfound interest. Why would you do that? Vivian sank onto the porch railing, suddenly looking exhausted. Because Andrew Everett is a manipulative bastard who doesn't deserve to take anything else from you. The raw honesty in her voice was startling. What happened? Madeline asked before she could stop herself. Vivian laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. The same thing that always happens with men like Andrew. Once he had me, I became disposable. Replaceable. She looked directly at Madeline for the first time. Just like you were. The words should have stung, but instead, Madeline felt an odd sense of validation. So there's already someone new? His name is Rebecca, Vivian confirmed. She works in the accounting department. 28. Pretty. Ambitious. The perfect trifecta, Madeline murmured, recognizing the pattern. A heavy silence settled between them, thick with unspoken truths and shared humiliation. For what it's worth, Vivian finally said, I'm sorry. Not just for the affair, but for who I was that day in your bedroom. I was cruel. Madeline regarded her carefully, weighing the apparent sincerity against months of justified anger. Why come to me now? Why not just give your testimony and be done with it? Vivian's shoulders slumped slightly. Because I need to make this right, somehow. And because, she hesitated. Because Andrew told me about your restoration work. How it's your passion. And he's trying to use that against you now. Madeline tensed. What do you mean? He's planning to argue that you neglected the marriage in favor of your restoration projects. That you were emotionally unavailable because you were too obsessed with the house. Vivian's voice took on a harder edge. He's going to paint you as some kind of unstable workaholic who cared more about crown molding than her marriage. The audacity of it, using her passion, her professional dedication, as a weapon against her, made Madeline's blood boil. Yet there was something grimly validating about having her suspicions confirmed. Andrew had never truly valued her work. Had perhaps even resented it. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I'll make sure Eliza is prepared. Vivian nodded, standing to leave. At the top of the porch steps, she paused. For whatever it's worth, the house is magnificent. What you've done with it, it's real art. I think that's part of why he's so desperate to claim it. It's the most impressive thing he's ever been associated with, and he knows it. With that strangely profound observation, Vivian descended the steps and returned to her rental car, leaving Madeline to digest this unexpected twist in an already complicated narrative. Later that night, as she prepared for court, Madeline found herself standing in her home office, surrounded by the detailed documentation of her restoration work. Each portfolio represented hours of research, careful planning, and meticulous execution. This wasn't just a hobby or an obsession, it was her professional legacy. If Andrew wanted to attack that legacy, he would learn exactly how formidable she could be when defending something she truly loved. The courtroom hushed as Judge Kavanaugh reviewed the latest filings, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense reputation. Madeline sat beside Eliza, her posture perfect despite the tremors of anxiety rippling through her. Across the aisle, Andrew and Victor Parsons huddled in intense conversation, occasionally shooting glances toward the entrance as if expecting someone. Vivian's late, Eliza whispered, having spotted the same behavior. That could work in our favor. Madeline nodded slightly, trying to focus on the judge's impassive expression rather than the churning in her stomach. The past sleepless night had left her raw-nerved and jittery, a state she carefully concealed beneath a facade of calm composure. Judge Kavanaugh looked up, her piercing gaze sweeping the courtroom. Are we ready to begin, counselors? Victor rose quickly. Your Honor, we're still waiting for a key witness. If we could have a brief. The courtroom doors opened, and all heads turned as Vivian Daniels walked in, the click of her heels echoing on the marble floor. She wore a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger than her 32 years. But it wasn't her appearance that caused the ripple of murmurs through the gallery, it was the fact that she walked directly to Eliza's table and sat down beside Madeline. Andrew half rose from his seat, disbelief etched across his features. Victor placed a restraining hand on his arm, muttering something that made Andrew sink back down, his expression darkening. Now we're ready, Your Honor, Eliza announced, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Judge Kavanaugh's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Very well. Mr. Parsons, you may proceed with your argument regarding the commingling of assets. Victor cleared his throat, clearly thrown by this unexpected development. Yes, Your Honor. As outlined in our brief, we contend that Mrs. Everett's inheritance, specifically the trust fund used to purchase the marital home, was effectively commingled with marital assets through the extensive renovations and joint maintenance expenses. He continued, detailing Andrew's financial contributions to the property and arguing that these contributions entitled him to a share of the underlying asset. As Madeline had expected, he then pivoted to a more personal attack. Furthermore, Your Honor, we will present evidence showing that Mrs. Everett's obsessive focus on renovating the property contributed significantly to the deterioration of the marriage. Mr. Everett found himself essentially living in a perpetual construction zone, with his comfort and input consistently disregarded in favor of historical accuracy and Mrs. Everett's personal aesthetic preferences. Eliza was on her feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Parsons is attempting to introduce character allegations that have no bearing on the legal question of asset division. I'm inclined to agree, Judge Kavanaugh said, fixing Victor with a stern look. Unless you can demonstrate how Mrs. Everett's renovation decisions directly impact the legal question of commingling, I suggest you stick to financial arguments. Victor nodded, but the damage was done. Andrew's strategy was now clear. He intended to paint Madeline as an unreasonable, obsessive hobbyist whose restoration work had destroyed their marriage. When it was Eliza's turn to present, she methodically dismantled Victor's financial arguments, presenting clear documentation of how the trust had remained legally separate throughout the marriage. Then she called her first witness, Vivian Daniels. A hush fell over the courtroom as Vivian took the stand, avoiding Andrew's gaze as she was sworn in. Ms. Daniels, Eliza began, could you please explain your relationship to the parties in this case? Vivian squared her shoulders. I work at Callahan and Briggs with Andrew Everett. We had an affair that began approximately 10 months ago and ended 3 weeks ago. And during this affair, did Mr. Everett discuss his marriage or his home with you? Objection, Victor called. Hearsay. Your Honor, this goes directly to Mr. Everett's state of mind regarding the property in question, Eliza countered. Judge Kavanaugh considered briefly. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Counselor. Vivian continued, her voice steady. Yes, Andrew spoke about his home frequently. He was particularly proud of it, he called it his crown jewel and often took credit for its restoration in social settings. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Madeline felt a surge of indignation at the revelation, though it hardly surprised her. Can you elaborate on that? Eliza pressed. He would bring clients to the house for dinner parties and describe the renovation details as if they were his projects. I distinctly remember him telling a senior partner about how we had hand-stripped the original woodwork and researched period-appropriate paint colors. Vivian's eyes flickered to Madeline. Only later did I learn that his wife was the one who had done all of that work. Eliza nodded. And did Mr. Everett ever express frustration about these renovation projects? Never, Vivian stated firmly. In fact, he leveraged the house's beauty to advance his career, hosting partners and important clients there regularly. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Vivian continued to dismantle the narrative he'd been building. By the time Victor cross-examined her, the damage was done. His attempts to portray her as a vengeful ex-lover only highlighted the pattern of manipulation that had characterized Andrew's relationships. The final blow came when Eliza called Madeline to the stand. With quiet authority, she walked the court through her professional credentials, the market value of her restoration expertise, and the systematic documentation of every project she'd undertaken. Mrs. Everett, Eliza said, holding up a leather-bound portfolio. "Can you explain what this is?" Madeline smiled slightly. "That's the home improvement log that Andrew and I agreed to keep when we first bought the house. Every expense, every project, all documented with both our initials next to the entries we respectively managed." Eliza handed the portfolio to the judge. "Your Honor, if you'll review this document, you'll find that over the 7 years of the Everett's marriage, Mrs. Everett's initials appear beside approximately 98% of the renovation projects. Mr. Everett's contributions were limited to basic maintenance and a single painting project." Judge Kavanaugh flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. "And this was a system you both agreed to?" "Yes, Your Honor," Madeline confirmed. "Andrew was very insistent on documenting everything. He said it was important to have clear accountability in financial matters." A wry smile crossed the judge's face, the first crack in her impassive demeanor. Indeed. By the time Madeline stepped down, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted perceptibly. The narrative of the obsessive wife had crumbled, replaced by the image of a dedicated professional whose work had been appropriated and then attacked by her husband. When Judge Kavanaugh finally delivered her ruling, it was unequivocal: the house remained Madeline's separate property, with Andrew entitled only to a modest payment reflecting his documented contributions to specific improvements. As the court adjourned, Madeline felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not just the resolution of the legal battle, but the vindication of her work and her worth. She gathered her things slowly, savoring the victory. When she looked up, Andrew stood before her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, defeat, and something that might have been regret. "Congratulations," he said stiffly. "You've won." Madeline regarded him steadily. "No, Andrew. I've simply stopped losing." He flinched at that, his carefully constructed facade cracking further. "You never understood what I needed," he said, lowering his voice to avoid being overheard. "The house was your obsession, not mine." "Then why fight so hard to take it from me?" she countered. Andrew's gaze slid away from hers. "Because losing it meant I'd failed. Again." The admission hung between them, a rare moment of honesty in a relationship that had grown thick with deception. Madeline studied the man she had once known intimately, now a stranger wearing familiar features. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the hairline fractures in his confidence, the shadows of insecurity that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior. "The house was never just about property to you, was it?" she asked softly. "It was about appearances. Status." He met her eyes briefly before looking away. "It was the one thing in our life together that impressed people. That mattered." The truth of it stung, even now. All those years of pouring her heart into their home, believing they were building a shared future, while Andrew had seen it merely as a backdrop for his ambitions, an impressive set piece for his performance of success. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Andrew," she said finally, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "But I suspect you never will, as long as you're measuring yourself through other people's eyes." She turned away, not waiting for his response. Whatever Andrew Everett became after this, whether he found redemption or descended further into self-deception, was no longer her concern. The intertwining of their stories had reached its natural conclusion, leaving Madeline free to write the next chapters of her life unencumbered by his shadow. As she walked away, her steps echoed against the marble floor, each one carrying her further from the past and toward the woman she was becoming. A woman who had fought for what was hers and won. A woman who understood, finally, that a home wasn't merely walls and wood and historical detail, but a sanctuary built from self-respect and hard-won wisdom. The courthouse doors swung open before her, revealing a world bright with possibility.